rabbis get around and they talk and they say, let's make the courtyard an extension of a woman's hand or whatever. And then later on they discuss, well, if she doesn't accept a get or a divorce, let's just throw it over the fence because that means she got it, because that's an extension of her and she legally got it. These loopholes that are found, like I really sometimes get to the point when I talk to atheists or I talk to people from other religions that so much of Christianity that I used to be a part of and be a minister with, and even Judaism, is so much man-made theology, and that our relationship to God is what is so important. That's my main come away from. I don't want to debate Talmud. I'm not at all near to even discussing it. I'm just listening to it for so much of the first time. So
I think what you're saying resonates with everybody here. No one here believes that the Talmud or rabbis should speak in place of God, but we still have to appreciate their role in biblical Israel. They made up consensus. There had to be a ruling body. But the problem began when people started worshiping them. I mean, that's really what people do with rabbis nowadays. They elevate them to this unhealthy level. That's the problem. I think it takes a mature person to acknowledge that there could be man-made law that's obligatory and still be considered man-made infallible. Even the Talmud speaks about a sacrifice that these individuals have to bring when they offer the wrong ruling. So that's not the issue. I think the problem you have is with people elevating the Talmud to the level of the Torah. But regarding a woman being allowed to accept a get in her domain, I always saw that as a liberating thing. First of all, the notion of a woman having to accept a get for her to be divorced is a much later enactment by Rabbeinu Gershom. But most people don't know that the notion of agunot also applies to men in the Ashkenazi world. I guess they're called agunim, because according to Rabbeinu Gershom, this is, I guess, 1,000 years after the destruction of the temple, if a woman...
Define agunim.
Agunot means a chained woman. And so agunim would be a chained man. Chained in the sense that they're trying to get a divorce and they can't. The notion of agunim, it's in the masculine because it applies to men in the Ashkenazi world. Because they've outlawed polygamy in the Ashkenazi world, they also instituted practice that if the woman fails or refuses to accept the get, the man can divorce her. So the same thing happens, which happens with agunot, that men extort the family for millions of dollars to basically have them give their daughter, their niece, whoever, a divorce. So there's women who do the same thing, try to get a lot of money from men in order for them to accept the man's divorce. Nobody speaks of this because all you hear is about the plight of women and not the plight of men in religious circles. For good reason, but I always thought that the notion that if you drop the get anywhere in the woman's domain, that she's free, i.e. free to marry someone else, was a bit liberating than saying that if she doesn't physically get the get in her hands, even from a shaliach or some sort of representative, that she wasn't divorced. I agree that Talmud and the rabbis shouldn't be elevated to the level of Torah, although their voice is still important. They could be important and crucial to our religious society and not God-inspired to be deified. And that's something that people can balance nowadays. They think that you have to listen to someone, it's because everything they're saying must have been given on Mount Sinai. And that's really where the whole notion came from, because it's easier to teach it like that. It's easier to teach that our rabbis don't make mistakes, that they have this type of Ruach HaKodesh called Das Torah going all the way back to Moses. And it's really a form of rabbi worship. It's easier to present it like that than to say that, no, something could be fully man-made, sanctioned by God, and still full of mistakes. Why? Because that's the only way that you can build consensus in a society, unless you're going to have God walking in your midst, which doesn't happen in Scripture.
That's what I think I'm getting a hard time to wrap around my head, how much inspiration comes out of the oral Torah.
I'm against people studying Daf Yomi, by the way. They're learning things that they shouldn't be learning. One, it's not considered source material. Only because something appears in the Talmud does not mean it's source material. This is why we have codifications of Jewish law, because the rabbis wanted to make a distinction between what's source material, i.e. what's halacha, from what's agadah, just folklore and legend. Sometimes the reason for a law coming into existence falls under the status of Agadah, but it still gave birth to a law because this court could use anything they want to create a law from. Now, it's not a Torah law. It'll be like a gezerah or takana. A gezerah is a negative rabbinic command. A takana is a positive rabbinic command. A positive tells you to do something. A negative tells you not to do something. Right? But the command is that we have to listen to this court. So it's very confusing when you're going through. I mean, it's not even Mishnah. It's Gemara. I mean, Gemara is the commentary to the Mishnah. Daf Yomi. They skip the sections of the Mishnah that don't have Gemara in it. So all you're really studying is the opinion of Amoraim, people who didn't have smicha. It only leads to confuse you. I'm not sure what the thinking behind this was. Now that we have Shulchan Aruch, we have Mishnah Torah, we have Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, Mishnah Berurah, we have the law, then toss everything else away. Don't consider a Torah study. But people spend their whole day studying a daf so fast that there's no way they could really grasp what's going on. And they fail to study Torah, and they fail to study actual halacha, what's applicable. So this is why I'm not a fan of the whole Daf Yomi system. Unless you're an expert in Jewish law and you really want to know the arguments for every law. And that's really what I think the Sadducees were against. I believe the Sadducees, there's a misconception that the Sadducees were against oral law. It said that the Sadducees, I mean, it's a shame we don't have Josephus in Hebrew to see what it really says, but it says that they were against the traditions of the fathers. Now, the Talmud speaks of the Sadducees being in the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin are the individuals, the group, the court that created oral law. How can it be against oral law if they sat on the Sanhedrin? No, what they were against, in my opinion, is how oral law was developed, how rabbinic law was developed. They wanted laws, rabbinic laws, to come out of Torah stories or stories in Tanakh and not out of what they call the legends of the fathers, which is what we call Midrash and Agadah nowadays. Just like you just mentioned about the children of someone getting drunk, and this in some way modifies the halacha. There's no reason why a halacha should be modified because of that. Now, again, this court had the authority to do anything they wanted to that wasn't unethical or necessarily against the Torah, but I think this gives us a better glimpse of what people were fighting against in the first century. It's because people make no distinction between Midrash, Agadah, and Halacha. They think the Sadducees were against Halacha. But again, that's problematic when the Talmud says that they also sat on the Sanhedrin. As a matter of fact, the Sadducees at one time had their own Sanhedrin. And then only when that Sanhedrin was abolished, they actually created some temporary holiday to celebrate that. Not that the rabbis in the Talmud identified as Pharisees either, because that is there's no rabbi in the Talmud that ever identified as a Pharisee. Never. So this whole notion that the Pharisees back then are the rabbis of today or the fathers of the rabbis of today is completely nonsensical. As a matter of fact, that prayer for heretics, the 19th benediction, the Mishnah says that it was created for Pharisees because they were considered heretics. But this is never mentioned by counter-missionaries who hate Christians so much that they begin to identify with the Pharisees, the enemies of the Christians, just to piss them off. But it shows how much they really study their own text.